Hi everyone, welcome to session 8. This is part 1 of reading instruction for English language learners. As you can see, here we are in our course map. This is the first of 3 weeks on reading instruction. We'll be online today for this session and then in person for the next 2 reading sessions. And then for week 11, writing part 1, we'll be back online again and then finish out the course in person. All right, so here are our session goals for today. First, we will explain the relationships among phonemic awareness, phonics, word recognition, vocabulary, and reading fluency, and their role in supporting reading comprehension, and articulate areas of potential challenges for English language learners within each of these buckets. We'll understand similarities and differences among English language learners and English-only learners in the development of literacy skills and word abilities. And we'll analyze strategies for increasing reading fluency for English language learners and apply these strategies to your classroom setting. Just a quick note, as you noticed from the different readings that each of the sections had for this week, there's certainly a lot of differences when we think about reading development for younger English language learners and older English language learners. And the readings provided a lot of that sort of diverse perspective. The areas that we'll be focusing on in this session today are areas that will certainly overlap between English language learners of all ages, and I will definitely point out some areas that may be more particular to younger or older English language learners, but certainly in your reflections and your discussions, you should take what you can apply from both these lectures and the readings you did and fit them into your own context and your own students, as we always do. Here's our agenda. So doing a quick overview of the session, and as you've done in previous online sessions, you'll do a mix of different types of activities, from lectures to discussion posts to a couple online activities. And so for today, we'll start with this lecture. This is lecture 1, Reading and Language, the Big Picture. This will end with a prompt for you to respond to on a discussion board. And as always, you will post an original response to the questions as well as respond to at least one colleague. And as a reminder, that's why the completion of this online module is due by the end of day this Friday. So you have that time to post your original responses as well as respond to colleagues. Then you'll watch lecture 2, which is about foundational reading skills in ELLs. That will end with a second discussion prompt. And then you will go into a third lecture about fluency instruction in particular. And that will end with an activity where you'll analyze and read through a series of different fluency strategies and apply a couple of those strategies of your choosing to your classroom setting. We'll wrap up this session by talking about your next assignment, which is not a lesson plan this week, but an assignment that will ask you to select 2 informational texts for your students and provide a rationale for why you selected those texts. So I will be sure to explain that in more detail before you finish this online session. All right, so let's get started with the first part of the lecture, and this is about the connection between reading and language development. And so we are going to really zoom out and look at the big picture and think about what this means for our ELLs as they're learning to read in English. Okay. First thing that's really important as sort of a foundational understanding here, and this was something that was repeated throughout the readings you did this week, is the deep connection between oral language and literacy. And when we think about the interplay between these two systems, it's really important to recognize that oral language is truly the primary system. When we think about kids learning a first language, they definitely learn their oral language, speaking and listening, first, and on that they layer the literacy, the reading and the writing skills. And so in large part, literacy is dependent on a foundation of oral language. People make meaning from what we read when we understand the words in the text, when we have that that oral language in our brains that we can connect that text to. Similarly, when we communicate in writing, it's really important that we're first able to communicate in speaking. Those two can't exist separately. Now, a couple of your readings pointed out a sort of ongoing debate that has been true in the ELL world, which is, so if literacy is the secondary system to oral language, then should we wait until students have developed a foundation of oral language before teaching literacy in English? And ultimately, most of the research lands on the side that that is not best practice. So we're not saying here that you should wait to teach literacy until students have an oral language foundation. They go together. You have to sort of teach both simultaneously, but it's just really important to recognize that building oral language skills will accelerate reading development and writing development for students. A couple of quotes here that I think are really striking, at least have been striking for me when it comes to the importance of reading. Here's a quote by Hernandez. 1 in 6 children who are not reading proficiently in 3rd grade fail to graduate from high school on time, 4 times the rate for children with proficient 3rd grade reading skills. So for those of us who teach young elementary students, this puts a ton of urgency on the work that you all are doing to help ensure that by the time they hit 3rd grade, students are on track to proficient reading. And also for those of us who teach older students, thinking about students who come in significantly behind grade level, we know that given these statistics, they are on a path that may not lead them to the type of success we want them to have. And so what can we do to help fill those gaps and to help set them up for success, to help set them up to beat those odds? Certainly, there's a widely recognized intersection between poverty and reading failure, or gaps in reading abilities. Another quote by Hernandez says, "For children who were poor, lived in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, and not reading proficiently, the proportion jumped to 35%. So, in other words, the dropout rate and the rate of students who are not able to graduate on time were compounded when poverty was an additional factor. So all of this to say that there's a lot of urgency behind the work that we are doing to improve and build the reading skills of our English language learners. Okay, so what sorts of unique challenges do ELLs face that non-ELLs may not? What makes this work that much more important for English language learners? Of course, the challenges that our ELLs face are related to their language proficiency level, and they may look different for lower ELD levels than for higher ELD levels. But some of the challenges they face are just smaller English vocabularies in general. We looked at that scale of how students are expected to learn about 1,000 word families a year when they're in school, and our ELLs are coming in already thousands of words behind their peers. So that can create challenges when it comes to reading. They have less familiarity with English discourse patterns, text structures, ways that stories are conveyed, narratives are structured, can be very different from one language to another. And so that lack of familiarity with English patterns may prove challenging. Our ELLs are also often coming in with less background knowledge, which we talked about quite a bit. And this can make it very difficult for them to infer important ideas in texts and make connections to things that they read in texts. And so while there are some unique challenges that our ELLs face, ultimately our goal is to ensure that they are able to read proficiently enough to comprehend everything that they're reading. And comprehension is truly the most essential factor here. It's at the core. It's the ultimate goal of reading. If students can decode beautifully and read fluently, but they can't understand what they read, then there's really no point. And I'm sure you have students in your class who you can think of right now who may fall into that bucket. And typically when we think about how a native English speaker progresses through their schooling experience, we talk about how from grades, K to 3, students are really learning how to read. And then beyond third grade, they need to be able to read to learn. So they shouldn't be learning how to read anymore at that stage. Now, obviously, for our ELLs, for our struggling students, that timeline and that trajectory doesn't play out exactly at that pace necessarily, but ultimately we have to get all of our students to a point where they can read to learn, and so they can read about really deep content across all of their classes. And so comprehension is at the core of that. Think for a moment about how your students who struggle with reading comprehension, who lack reading comprehension, how this impacts their motivation to read, how they're able to or not able to gain knowledge about the world around them, their vocabulary acquisition. Are they able to learn new words as they read, to approach challenging words that they haven't seen before? And ultimately their civic engagement. Think about all the times and the ways that people have to read and interact with text to be engaged members of society, and how a lack of reading comprehension can really make it so that you can't have you don't have a fair playing field in contributing to your society. So ultimately, this has to be the core of our work. So remember, for a moment, we're going to refer to this often, WIDA's definition of academic language. They talk about how academic language exists at the word or phrase level, the sentence level, and the discourse level. And in our last couple classes, we've really focused on that word and phrase level, which is all about vocabulary, academic vocabulary, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 words, idioms, expressions, nuances and shades of meaning, all of that. And that is certainly an important factor in reading comprehension and reading skill. But when you think about what you do when you read a text and how you make sense of that text, even as a proficient adult reader, you're not just living at that word or phrase level. You are thinking about the way that sentences are structured and how ideas are connected to one another, so you are also focusing at the sentence level. And the discourse level, all about how texts are organized, how ideas flow from one to the other, how you're ultimately able to make larger meaning out of individual ideas. And so you are absolutely working at the discourse level as well. So all of these features of academic language become crucial as people are reading texts. So now we're about to stop the lecture, and you're going to go into your first discussion post. And so the way you're going to do this is in the discussion number 1 folder, you'll see a passage. And this is a technical passage that is geared towards adults. This is not something that necessarily your students would read, but it's designed to simulate for you what is happening for you as a reader and how you're making meaning as you approach a text. So you'll read the passage on your own and reflect afterwards on what you did as a reader to make meaning. Everything that you were doing. So it's going to be tricky. You're going to try to sort of step out of your brain and think about what different processes your brain engaged in to make sense of what you read. And I encourage you to start as small as you can. Think about individual letter sounds. What was your brain having to do with those individual letter sounds to read words and to ultimately make meaning from words and sentences and phrases? And so I want you to start at that level. Think about what additional resources would have been helpful for you to comprehend the text better. And I want you to consider the different language subsystems that you used as you were reading. I'm going to walk through them briefly on the next slide, and they're also going to be listed in the discussion post folder. So think about within each of these subsystems, how did you use them to make meaning of the text? When you post your discussion, be sure to refer to things you heard in this lecture as well as information from the course readings this week. So here's a list of those language subsystems. Again, you'll find a more detailed version of this list within the discussion post folder, but I want you to think about phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, orthography, etymology, and metacognition. Think about which of these you were using and how you were using them as you made sense of that text you read. Okay, so stop here, go into the discussion post folder, complete that activity, make sure you post your own original response, and then be sure to respond to a colleague as well before the Friday deadline. All right, see you in lecture number 2.